The IDF Super Churchill What If Part 2. Let's do a quick project review from where we left off in Part 1 video. Link to that video is in the description down below if you guys have not seen Part 1 yet. And these are all filmed off of our YouTube channel live stream that happened through the course of last year. The Churchill is the Tamiya's venerable Mark 7 from the 70s, and I've decided to update this kit into an Israeli Super Churchill conversion, taking a lot of my knowledge of armor of that time frame, what the Israelis were trying to do, and then combining it with the Centurion Sho't call Gimel kit in terms of parts, replacement, updates, taking the concept of what if the Israelis had used another British tank to good effect. They did that with the Super Sherman, they did it with the Centurions, they've done it with AMX-13s, etc. But we're ready to primer. I've done quite a bit of work on the Churchill to this point in time. We've got some textured surfaces. We've got a lot of the parts kind of built out. I've got the side skirts kind of mocked up and stuff like this. And so let's get some primer going. And if you're new to this conversation, if you haven't watched these streams before, I've spent a lot of time in the last year or so discussing colored primers underneath the paint. And the purpose of this kind of dusty mauve shade is to reinforce what will ultimately be a really, really strong Israeli sand gray color later on. So, but this project being kind of a mishmash of time frames and paint jobs and now rebuild, it needs a fresh coat of primer before we can do anything. And so I'm using the Mission Models primer here, and I've taken the red oxide primer and mixed in a bit of the pink to create this color. And then when I spray it, I'm spraying, as you notice here with the primer, that it's a thin coat that hits kind of wet. And when you're airbrushing a primer, that's the key to success with it, so that it adheres properly to the plastic or the resin or the metal. You want to make sure that you build up your opacity relatively slowly. And if you've never airbrushed something like a Churchill before, you'll quickly realize it has a lot of little nooks and crannies and hidden areas. And so the key to this is really get in the difficult spots first, don't overdo it, control that, and then build out the easy to reach areas with the primer second. That way you have nice even coverage when you're done without any real mess ups. But I was using this, like I said, on the live stream, and felt it was a little bit better of a conversation to do this section by section and show everybody kind of as I go along, and getting to the painting point was a little bit easier to do on a stream versus thing. But I didn't have a lot of time to paint the whole thing, so I've done a little bit of a taped off and done a section here on the left side of the track cover and the fenders and side of the hull and stuff. So while that dries, I want to update you guys on the turret as well. I've added all the appropriate weld beads. To this model, I've added the Centurion side stowage bins and started to attach some of the blazer armor to the front of it, showing you with green stuff putty how I applied the welds. If you recall, we molded out the rear turret counterweight. I've shaped that down and added some Mr. Surfacer texture onto that. Get that ready for paint. And this is the main crux of this particular project in terms of how it's going to look at the end. It's a single color and it's Israeli sand gray, and the time frame is late 70s, early 80s, and so it's important to really nail this color so that you saw this as an Israeli tank versus, say, just a Churchill and sand camo. That wasn't the end game. So again, using the Mission Models, I'm staying within the ecosystem of this paint brand for a couple of reasons. One is it's water-based and non-toxic. It's really nice to spray. It sprays as well as any lacquers on the market today. And if you're struggling with this paint, you don't know how to use it, or you've tried to transition over to it unsuccessfully, two things you need to be aware of. First one is do not use alcohol, isopropyl alcohol, anything of the sort with this paint at all. Period, end of story. It's not even a conversation. It's a non-starter. You will have problems. It's hypersensitive to alcohol. I'm talking 1 to 2% content. It is sensitive to it. So do not use alcohol of any way, shape, or form in airbrushes, your brushes, your cups, cleaning, thinning, etc. with Mission Models. Second one is just don't use lacquer thinner for this for all the same reason, except instead of breaking it down like the alcohol does, it will gum it up. You keep those two things away and you shouldn't have any problems. I tend to run my airbrushes as like I said, as an ecosystem. So I have a Mission Models airbrush. It's just for water-based airbrushing. I don't put anything else in it. When you're mixing the paint, the best way to kind of describe how I thin the paint is just use the visual check there that you can see as the runoff off the side of the cup. And then when you get to the airbrush, all my airbrushes have an adjustable handle for the needle distance movement, and then they have a MAC valve to precisely control the PSI. Once I get the paint in the airbrush, I always run a quick little spray test, see how it goes, and as you can see here, it sprays beautifully, and then coming right over the primer, which has now had a chance to cure a bit, and then slowly building up my first layer of colors in a controlled manner, slightly off camera, but again, it's a live stream, so sometimes I'm answering questions and I'm talking to people on the chat, so sometimes I get a little distracted with my camera work. But really, it's just laying down that first bit of color. And in this project, like I mentioned before, there's two reasons I use the paint. The second reason is what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a layered, distressed, chipped end result here. It's not a hairspray chipping. It's not chipping of what you're used to. What it is, what I'm trying to do is showcase a vehicle that's been in service for probably well over a decade, if not longer, 20, 30 years, something like that. How many times it's been repainted by the IDF, I'm not really sure, but it would probably be very well maintained over the course of a couple of decades of use. That is standard practice in that military. So what I wanted to do was spray a darker, truer color first over the primer, and that pink kind of lets that sand color really showcase itself as a warm temperature, warm climate, sand color with a bit of gray, so that you understand it's Israeli when you see it. That's the whole purpose of the painting. There's a bit of color theory here. The live stream gets into it much better than this short little video does. So if you're really interested in that conversation, definitely watch the live stream at length, and you can get a bit deeper of a conversation about what I'm trying to do with the colors here. And I'll do some color theory videos in the future as well, you know, focusing on it. But for here purposes, I'm just using the primer color as kind of making sure that my sand gray came out the way I wanted it to come out. That's basically what's happening here. And as you can see, again, Churchill spraying is its own thing. Again, if you're not familiar with this, it just has a lot of little you know, nooks and crannies and hidden spots to get properly. So it's a little bit on the tedious side in terms of tank airbrushing, but you'll find a lot easier if you split it up into a hole, and then the upper hole, and then the turret. So and then moving on to the section I had masked off with the red, coming back in with the gray over that. Again, first steps are always, you know, really sensitive. Take your time, get that first coat in there. If you don't know what that circular device is, that's a Lazy Susan I got from local Target store that allows you to spin that around quite easily. It's a helpful tool for when you're airbrushing and stuff of this nature. So then from there, it's the same process that you've been watching here for the last few minutes. It just, you know, get around the details first and then fill in between. That way you have a nice even coat when you airbrush your models. That's kind of the basic parameters here that you're seeing. And as you see, as that paint starts to dry, one of the nicer qualities of this paint is it's beautifully matte when it's finished, which is going to come into play in the second part when I'm going to add on a lighter coat. It's not really a post shade. It's technically like a second layer of color that is designed to be an aged layer of color versus, say, like a post shading, pre-shading conversation. It's not really intended to be that. This is actually kind of painting an older color underneath, because we're going to wear away the top color with water to reveal that darker layer down below, and then you're going to get, and you'll see later in the video, a really nice kind of distempered, patinaed, not fully flaky chip like hairspray chipping is, but much more of an in-service look for the longevity of the type of vehicle that we're doing here. So I throw in a bunch of neutral tan into the mix, reset the thinning ratio, blend it up, emulsify everything really good. Anytime you're blending paint in general, it doesn't matter what it is, you want to make sure you're mixing properly. So that's what they call by emulsification. I'm adjusting the thinning ratio here because I've added more paint to that batch. It's a pretty simple, straightforward process, and then I'm going to check it against the side of the cup to make sure the runoff is nice and smooth the way I like it. And then as you see here, this is the second layer of color. I kind of tie the whole thing in with this. Technically, it's not really a post shade, so again, this is going to be a little bit of a different type of painting process than some of you are probably used to seeing. I'm not trying to fade that paint in terms of that post shaded purpose. This is really designed as a two-layer color, similar to how I do olive drab, where I put a darker shade down and put a lighter shade on top of it, and then I wear off that lighter shade in a real subtle manner with a liquid. In this case, it'll be water. That way I'll get a nice two-layer chipping system out of this. Plus you'll get some red primer chips peeking through a little bit as well. So my priority with this paint job, to kind of paraphrase the whole entire process here, is I'm prioritizing that, what I just described, that kind of longevity, wear and tear in the paint. I want to achieve that first and foremost above chipping. And then second to that, I want to have really good color accuracy, that you understand this is an Israeli gray vehicle, because it's very distinct and I didn't want it to look sand or anything of the sort. So I chose the grayer tone. Those are my two priorities here. From that, I can then work into the weathering and then tuning the red primer to be a little bit more red in areas that's more exposed and things of that ilk. A little bit easier to do in that setup. So again, this was described in detail within the live stream. So if you need more conversation on that purpose, go ahead and check that out. But you can see here with the chipping, the main thing with this is using the chipping brush with the water. That's all that is. There's nothing else in between here. There's nothing else going on. You see how little water is going down. It's almost not even wet. It's just a slight sheen to the brush, if you will. It's probably 99% dry. And what happens is as you do this to mission models paints in particular, a couple things, because it's a dead matte paint, which is beautiful, it burnishes up and it creates a secondary level of a shiny or sheen to it, which is what happens in the real world with matte paint, is you burnish it and you chip it as you go over a long period of time. You can see here on the side of the air cleaner here, quite distinctly what happens to it is, as that water starts to wear away that light sand color on top, the darker color that I sprayed first starts to become revealed. That's the purpose of the two-layer paint system here. And then from that, I will then continue that wear and tear until I see a couple of the hard edge chips start to form around the sharp details, if you will, around the stowage bins and the locks and things of that nature. That'll kind of pop up with the chipping, but I'm not trying to get flaky chipping off of this. And then when I do want something a little bit more determined, I grabbed my little Tamiya stir stick and did a few scratches on this as well, just to showcase how that process works. But that's it for this update on part 2 of the Super Churchill. We will get into additional painting, moving over the top of the hull and into the turret in the next video. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much.